Warning: the following episode contains a description of physical violence against a young boy and different forms of self-mutilation. Listener discretion is advised. Whenever he was asked about Zen, Master Gutei simply stuck up one finger. He had a boy attendant whom a visitor asked, "What kind of teaching does your master give?" The boy held up one finger too. Hearing of this, Gutei cut off the boy's finger with a knife. As the boy ran away, screaming with pain, Gutei called to him. When the boy turned his head, Gutei stuck up one finger. The boy was suddenly enlightened. When Gutei was about to die, he said to the assembled monks, "I received this one finger Zen from Tenryu. I've used it all my life, but have not exhausted it." Having said this, he entered nirvana. Hello and welcome to a new type of episode of Wright on Buddhism, called the Kōan Series. In the Kōan Series, we will read and discuss famous koans used by real Buddhist monks from such sources as the Blue Cliff Record, the Gateless Gate, the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and many others. Full disclosure, this is not how koans are used or ought to be used in Buddhist practice, but I'm here to give some extra context and meaning to some of these koans so that you might see them in a new light and gain some new or deeper meaning from them than you did before. I hope you enjoy. For more details on the koan process, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism, episode 32, What are Koans? And for more on Zen Buddhism, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism, episode 10, What is Zen? I will include the links in today's show notes. In short, koans are phrases and questions that are a part of Zen or Chan Buddhist practice. They are often seemingly meaningless or nonsensical phrases or unanswerable questions given to a practitioner by a master to meditate on. The practitioner commonly strives to observe the phrase, or to meditate on a particular unusual phrase until they've reached the point of some higher understanding or awakening. This practice is thought to help the practitioner come to a sudden, deep understanding or awakening that is known as satori in Japanese. Think of it like an aha moment on steroids. Today's koan is known in English as Gutei's One Finger, and it comes to us from the Koun Yamada translation of the Gateless Gate, which as you remember is known as the Wumen Guan in Chinese or the Mumonkan in Japanese. If you remember from before, this is a collection of 48 Chan or Zen koans compiled in the early 13th century by the Chinese Zen master Wumen Huikai. This is one of the most important compilations of koans in all of Chan or Zen Buddhism, the other being the Blue Cliff Record, which was compiled in 1125 in Song Dynasty, China. As you can see, Gutei's One Finger is a much longer koan than we're used to, and it is likely that this koan would be given to a practitioner later in their koan practice than the others that we've discussed so far. That's because the difficulty of reconciling this one with fundamental and basic teachings in Buddhism, such that you come to a more profound realization about them, is remarkably harder. For example, each of the previous ones we have discussed for this series almost immediately set off alarm bells in my head for an analysis of Buddha nature, and I don't even have the textual and practical background that many monks in the Chan and Zen tradition likely do. Buddha nature is not what I would call a fundamental teaching of Buddhism, but it is a very popular and influential one in East Asian Buddhism. With my own background studying and analyzing East Asian Buddhism, I did not have to do a lot of critical thinking to see Buddha nature in the previous koans. All of these episodes include my own interpretation and analysis, but I believe there is sufficient evidence to suggest that the ideas I bring up are going on in the koan that I'm talking about that day, based on what we have read and discussed together before on this show, and also based on my own scholarly background in Mahayana Buddhism. This koan, however, presents a much more complicated interpretive and analytical task. It depicts a master cutting off the finger of a young boy, seeming to violate the very first moral precept of all different schools and branches of Buddhism, ahimsa, or nonviolence against all sentient beings. So what is really going on in this koan then? Based on my own interpretation and analysis, I think that the relevant concepts to discuss here would be mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma, the concept of understanding reality exactly as it is in Chan or Zen Buddhism, and the role of physical mutilation in Chan or Zen Buddhism. So let's get started, beginning with the mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma. What does this actually mean? What role does it play in Zen or Chan discourse? How is it relevant to this discussion of Gutei's One Finger? Let's start with the concept of transmission of the Dharma, and then we will come back around to the mind-to-mind part. The model established by the life of the Buddha for the transmission of knowledge or understanding of the Dharma was complicated because it depended on who he was talking to. First off, if you remember the story of the life of the Buddha, we should note that he came to an understanding of the Dharma on his own after leaving a few teachers who left him dissatisfied on his quest to defeat old age, illness, and death. He sat under a Bodhi tree for 49 days defeated the god of desire and death known as Marrow, and had an experience of perfect and complete enlightenment. This was the culmination, we later found out, of eons and eons of bodhisattva work that he did in his past lives, before he was even born as Siddhartha Gautama. These past lives are documented in the Jataka tales, wherein the Buddha, in some past life or the other, engages in some great act of generosity, of concentration, of practice, or one of the other 6 bodhisattva perfections, or paramitas. One interpretation of that is that though the Buddha himself achieved enlightenment on his own without a previous teacher, it was only because he had been practicing and meditating and studying with teachers for so many lifetimes. The reason we're talking about this is that there are actually a couple of very important questions at stake here. The first is the question of whether or not enlightenment is something that you can actually get on your own, or if you need a teacher to help you on the way. The Zen or Chan schools have a specific answer to that question that we'll discuss in a moment. The second is, in the event that you need a teacher, can that teacher communicate the Dharma to you using words? Are words sufficient when trying to guide somebody on the path of enlightenment? The life of the Buddha, according to the Mahayana tradition's interpretation at the very least, brings up this question as well. After he became enlightened, the Buddha was hesitant to teach what he had realized. He was doubtful that it could ever be put into words because it was such a deep and complex realization, and he was doubtful anybody would understand it or take it to heart because human beings were so morally wretched and corrupt. He was urged, however, by a god to try and teach it because sentient beings needed to hear it. So he decided to go on to teach, and the first thing out of his mouth is, ostensibly, the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Flower Garland Sutra. I'm sure that you've heard me say on this show before that this is one of the most lengthy and complicated texts in all of Buddhism, so it goes without saying that his first audience was left quite confused and even upset in some cases. From this, he realized that he needed to simplify the teaching and start from step 1. The result is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, or the first sermon, where he lays out the 4 Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path. After that, the rest is history. This all seems to indicate at first glance that the life of the Buddha indicates that yes, words are sufficient for enlightening people, because the Buddha used words to transmit the Dharma while he was teaching, and somebody could even theoretically achieve enlightenment on their own without a teacher, if needed, so long as they've done bodhisattva work and had teachers in the past. This is true particularly for Pratyeka Buddhas, who allegedly come to enlightenment on their own through solitary contemplation of dependent origination. It isn't that simple, though. If you remember from our past episodes on skillful means, or upaya, the reason that the Buddha's sermons were so enlightening and regular old mundane language is not, has to do with the fact that the Buddha was a Buddha. Only fully realized Buddhas have the ability to use upaya, or skillful means, to transmit the teaching. If you remember, upaya is the fully enlightened being's ability to say or do the exact right combination of things to transmit the Dharma to whoever he or she is talking to in that moment, such that they are advanced on the path somehow because of it. This is a mastery of causes and conditions necessary to transmit the teaching. Nobody else can do that, only fully enlightened beings. The assumption here is that the enlightened arhats are not fully enlightened, but we won't get into that here because there's a lot of sectarian conflict at play in that discussion. Regardless, it seems as though the case here is that you need to commune with a fully enlightened being to become fully enlightened in a speedy fashion yourself. Thus, the Chan and Zen schools highly emphasize the necessity and utility of having a teacher. They argue that people are grasping blindly for the teaching without one. Imagine trying to learn to speak a different language without the assistance of books, teachers, listening aids, speaking practice, and so on and so forth. At that point, you're really just making things up, and you have no way of knowing if what you're doing is on the right path or not. This would eventually send you around in circles of just making things up and then either deciding that they work or they don't. Either way, you would not actually correctly learn the language that you're trying to teach yourself this way. As a result, in Chan and Zen Buddhism, there is a great importance and attention given to lineages. Every school and branch of Chan and Zen Buddhism has a list of names for who gave the teaching to whom, going all the way back to Mahakāssyapa, one of the disciples of the Buddha. These lists may or may not be historical, and they may not indicate that X master was truly a face-to-face student of Y master, but they're still maintained and looked upon with great respect just the same because there's a lot at stake in them. The lineages represent the distance between you, the learner, and the Buddha himself. If that line is broken, tainted, or messed up in some way, then what you are learning is further and further away from what the Buddha actually taught. This lineage is then how you are sure what you're doing is anything close to what the Buddha said you were supposed to do. We're now getting into sectarian Chan and Zen interpretations of the teaching. I just wanted to mention that because other schools in Mahayana, such as Pure Land, and other branches of Buddhism like Theravada have different views on what needs to be done to get from this state to an enlightened one. Onto this issue of mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma, there are a few things going on here. We've spoken about how transmission of the Dharma is supposed to work. It is supposed to take place between a student and a teacher. So why can't the teacher just do guided readings and guided meditations with the student so that they learn the teaching word for word, so to speak? Like the same way that American public school students learn everything. Here is all the information, remember it, and then regurgitate it back to me later, and if you regurgitate it perfectly, that means that you learned it all. The answer as to why this isn't the case is because then it would be just like the young boy in the koan going around and holding up his finger, just because Gutei held his up. He did not know why Gutei held up the finger. He did not know what the finger meant in Zen Buddhism. He just knew that when he asked Gutei what Zen was, he got the finger in response. That means that the young boy was running around with a crappy carbon copy of the teaching and not any real or true understanding of its meaning. I think of my own engagement with Buddhism in this exact way. I've read, interpreted, and analyzed so many of the texts, and sure, they have had an influence and impact on how I live my life, but I am not enlightened at all, and I likely will not become enlightened in this lifetime. There are people in the world who know 1/1000th the amount of stuff that I know about Buddhism who are yet 1,000 times more enlightened than me. That was a digression, but it deals with this issue of transmission of the Dharma. Words have connotations and meanings that we can and do easily get trapped under. They're dualistic in nature, and they are nothing more than a poor map of the territory and not the territory itself. The learner has to have some realization themselves in order to know the territory. They cannot have it explained to them. When words fail, what is left is this mind-to-mind transmission. What we're seeing now is the influence of esoteric Buddhism on Chan and Zen Buddhism with regards to the philosophy of language. Esoteric traditions argue that Buddhahood is achieved by means of ritual experience, and not by means necessarily of study. The words of the sutras and the other texts in Buddhism constitute the exoteric, or the obvious and revealed teaching, which is just the map of the esoteric, or the subtle and secret teaching that constitutes the territory. Thus, the mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma in Chan and Zen actually developed into a ritual that takes place between the master and student, where the master, through their fully enlightened use of upaya, gives the student an experience of fully realized enlightenment. The reason that the student still has to study and meditate leading up to this is so that they have good enough karma to be able to have this experience and receive the teaching and make sense of it. We saw this mind-to-mind transmission in the one-hand clapping koan, and we will no doubt see it again and again. It goes back, as you know, to the encounter between the Buddha and Mahakāssyapa and an audience of disciples, wherein the Buddha held up a flower and Mahakāssyapa smiled, and the Buddha then preached on mind-to-mind transmission of the teaching and how Kāssyapa was the only one who had gotten it. This sets up the context for why the young boy running around and holding his finger up was actually not truly the Zen of Gutei holding up his finger. The next thing we ought to discuss in the context of this koan is understanding reality exactly as it is in Chan or Zen Buddhism. This is commonly known in Japanese as Shobogen, the eye that can see the Dharma clearly. This is a very complicated topic that has been written about extensively in philosophy all over the world in all different time periods. Can we know reality exactly as it is? If so, how? Is how we know the world the same as it is in its true nature? If not, what is missing? And so on and so forth. These questions and the different answers to them are interesting and relevant to the study of Zen, but I'm not going to get into them here because the only one I have time to talk about is the Chan and Zen answer to this question. That answer is that everything in reality is fully expressing everything about its nature at all times, but we just are not enlightened enough to see it. It just takes an enlightened eye, or the Shobogen, to see that true nature and understand it. This nature, as we've talked about before, is its suchness, or in Sanskrit, ta-ta-ta. This is even true of each of us. We are all originally enlightened, and we just have to get past our own deluded way of seeing, which is weighed down by incorrect beliefs and perceptions and knowledge, such as thinking that capital S self exists, thinking that reality is not always fully presenting its suchness at all times, and so on and so forth. Other schools have different interpretations of suchness. Whereas Chan and Zen Buddhists believe that all reality is all the Dharma all at once, so long as we come to an enlightened understanding of non-duality and emptiness, other Buddhists believe that there are parts of reality that are enlightening, and there are other parts that are not. Or they believe that suchness is not itself the complete Dharma, or so on and so forth. The fact that Chan or Zen Buddhists believe the way they do about suchness reflects yet another influence of esoteric Buddhism. As we have frequently talked about before, the esoteric Buddhists believe that the entire world is actually the body of the cosmic Buddha Vairocana, but this body is not a physical body necessarily. Instead, it's the Dharma body. So it is the corpus of his teachings, and each thing in the world makes up the letters and the words of this teaching, and it is constantly being preached to itself. We are also letters and words in the unfolding of this world text system, which lends credence to the Zen idea I brought up a second ago about everything and everyone being originally enlightened, and also everything and everyone fully expressing their suchness at all times. In Zen Buddhism, they don't believe necessarily in this world text system, or that everything is a manifestation of the cosmic Buddha Vairocana, but they do believe some important things that are related to this doctrine. They believe that the entire world is non-dual with the Dharma itself, and they also believe that Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, is non-dual with the Dharma. Remember that Shakyamuni Buddha is a fully realized Buddha who can use upaya to enlighten us all very quickly. So if we come to a correct understanding of the world around us, we come to experience Shakyamuni himself preaching the Dharma to all of us by means of every single thing in reality. I should also mention that this is a point of influence on Chan and Zen from Pure Land traditions as well. If we study and practice and come to a fully enlightened view of the world, we are technically perceiving and living in the Pure Land of Shakyamuni Buddha. We don't frequently talk about Shakyamuni's Pure Land on this show because of Amida and his Pure Land, and how easy it is theoretically to get to it according to the Pure Land tradition. But we are all technically right now in Shakyamuni's Pure Land, which is known as Jambudvipa. The reason why we still see it as an impure and unenlightened place, which is not at all how Amida's Pure Land looks, is because, according to Pure Land thinkers, his promise and his bodhisattva work was not as significant as Amida's. We won't go too far down that rabbit hole either, other than to say that it exists. Regardless, you can see that Chan and Zen have a serious concern with perceiving reality exactly as it is. This is accomplished through meditation and study, and the result is a fully enlightened view of the world around you, where everything you see, experience, touch, do, believe, etc. is the Dharma. Even just a flower that you hold up to an audience, or even one finger that you hold up when a young boy asks you what is Zen. Before we move on, I'll share Koun Yamada's translation of Mumon's commentary on this particular koan. He writes, "The enlightenment of Gutei and the boy have nothing to do with the tip of a finger. If you realize this, Tenryu, Gutei, the boy, and you yourself are all run through with one skewer." I hope this lends credence to the analysis and interpretation I've been providing thus far. The skewer here seems to be fully realized enlightenment, taken here to mean perception of reality exactly as it is. After all of this, however, we have still not yet made sense of why Gutei cut the boy's finger off, other than to say that the young boy thought the Dharma was an index finger and he was wrong about that. One way of looking at it is that he actually wasn't wrong. The Dharma, according to Gutei, was the index finger. However, that's kind of an incomplete understanding of what the meaning of the teaching and the meaning of the action of raising the index finger actually was. And that way of understanding is very different from what the young boy thought it was. Remember that we've established that the young boy was just going around copying Gutei without any idea why Gutei expressed the teaching in the way that he did. This, according to Gutei, was a very teachable moment. And so Gutei thought that he would teach the young boy all of the necessary context in a very gruesome way. To make sense of all of this, we should talk about the role of physical mutilation in Chan and Zen Buddhism. As we have mentioned earlier in the episode, Gutei cutting off the finger of the young boy appears to be a clear violation of ahimsa, the precept of nonviolence against all sentient beings. This is indeed the case, but as we've talked about before, upaya is often used in Mahayana to justify morally dubious things. The idea being that if you do the thing with the intention of enlightening the person expediently, then the action is morally forgivable. So we can infer that this is a case of upaya. However, why did he specifically choose physical mutilation as his teaching tool in this case? Never assume that the way that these koans play out is random or otherwise not thought out in every small specific way. These stories likely never happened, and instead they were carefully crafted using familiar characters in the Zen literary and historical tradition to convey a very specific message. So in that case, Gutei ostensibly knew what he was doing when he did it, and the reason that that's included in the story is to teach us something from hearing it. Physical mutilation actually has a very long history in Buddhism. You might remember a moment ago when we mentioned the Jataka tales, or tales of the Buddha's past lives, And perhaps the most famous Jataka tale, the tale of the hungry tigress, a past incarnation of Shakyamuni Buddha when he was still a bodhisattva known as Prince Sattva, was out walking with a disciple, and while out there, he saw a starving tigress who was about to eat her cubs to prevent her starvation. To prevent this, Prince Sattva killed himself and allowed the tigress to eat him instead. This is regarded as the utmost self-sacrificial and compassionate act. Prince Sattva was, according to interpretations of this story, so enlightened and had cultivated such generosity and such a deep understanding of non-self that he was ready at the drop of a hat to sacrifice his body to save the tigress and her cubs. This is not the only Buddhist myth where things like this happen. There are tons of stories where ascetics will cut off limbs to feed the animals or other beings. These stories are trying to demonstrate and exemplify the teaching of non-self and the bodhisattva ideal of compassion and generosity. Thus, in the history of Mahayana in China, for example, and in Japan, there are accounts of monks and practitioners who would copy sutras in their own blood, who would put their own hair into statues, or who would do other forms of self-mutilation to exemplify that idea of compassion and self-sacrifice and generosity. They were also demonstrating their deep knowledge and their deep understanding of non-self. In some cases, they were also trying to create a karmic connection between the practitioner and the text or the statue or things like that. Physical mutilation is also a symbol of dedication and exertion on the path of enlightenment. There are Chinese Buddhist schools which will take a stick of incense and lay it across their scalp and then burn it, creating these lines of burn scars across their heads. This is carried out as an initiatory ritual when one takes the precepts and enters the monastery, and it speaks to the physicality and somaticity of the Dharma. Another very famous and important legend concerns the semi-mythical patriarch of Zen Buddhism, Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma was the first patriarch of Chan Buddhism in China, but he was the 28th patriarch in a lineage of teachers and students that is commonly traced straight back to Mahakāssyapa and Shakyamuni. He has a lot of legendary stories attached to him, but perhaps the most famous is the story of his meditation in the cave. The story goes that Bodhidharma came to China from India to give them the proper teachings, and he tried to enter a Shaolin monastery, but he was refused entry into it. And so upon this refusal, he resolved himself to sit in a cave and meditate on the cave wall, not speaking or anything for 9 years. My professors called this watching wall television. However, after 7 years, he fell asleep. When he woke up, he was so frustrated with having fallen asleep that he cut off his own eyelids. Some versions of this legend say that where he tossed his eyelids is where the first tea leaf plants in all of China sprouted. He resumed his meditation, and after it concluded, he was allowed to enter the Shaolin temple. Because he had done this, we commonly see statues and images of Bodhidharma where he has a very hardcore or mean-looking expression on his face. That is not because he's especially mean, although he is said to have been the progenitor of martial arts in China, but because he actually has lost his eyelids. This act was a show of devotion to his mindfulness and meditation and his great understanding of non-self. That being the case, physical mutilation plays a significant role in Chan and Zen Buddhism. It's a form of self-sacrifice, because the idea is that by resolving to the practice and the bodhisattva path, the practitioner is saving all sentient beings, and so all sacrifices made on that path are actually sacrifices for saving all sentient beings. These sorts of things are very meritorious in one's practice. That's not to say that physical mutilation is actively encouraged anymore. In fact, most contemporary interpretations center around how Gutei cutting off the kid's finger was symbolic of cutting off his ego and his delusion. This is not an invalid interpretation, but I brought up the issue of physical mutilation to contextualize our interpretation of this koan in the history and the developments of Chan and Zen Buddhism. Taking all of these points together, we can now level an informed interpretation and analysis of the koan at hand. The reason that, when asked about what the teaching was, Gutei held up his finger has to do with the mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma. The Dharma can't really always be explained in a conventional way, and so by unconventional means, such as koans, raising flowers, or raising one finger, teachers employ a skillful means of communicating that information which is ineffable. That is exactly how Gutei had gotten it from Tenryu. Thus, the importance of lineages is also presented in this koan. The reason why it was not acceptable for the young boy to run around holding up his finger, claiming that he understood the teaching, was because he understood the Dharma as, quite literally, being the finger. Like he thought that the Dharma was just his index finger, and not the sutras, and not the middle finger, and not the Vinyas, and not the Abhidharma, and not the flower being held up to Mahakāssyapa, and so on and so forth. This is an incorrect understanding of the Dharma, and it's a misunderstanding of how to understand reality exactly as it is. The young boy saw only his finger. He did not see the symbolic act of presenting just the thing as the Dharma itself. He didn't understand that whenever Gutei held up just one finger, he was actually referring to the suchness, the completeness of reality, and how reality is always, at all times, in all cases, the entire Dharma. In Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism, presencing or understanding reality exactly as it is, as it unfolds, is one of the sole concerns, and so what the young boy was doing was incorrect. You'll remember Mumon's commentary where he said that enlightenment had nothing to do with the tip of the finger. This was precisely the boy's mistake. Thus, Gutei perceived this as a teachable moment. He took the chance to cut off the boy's finger, which is a symbolic act. It's symbolic of the physical mutilation that we've talked about thus far, which is an act of self-sacrifice, of upaya, and of mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma. After this, the boy understood, and he was enlightened. This serves as a model for how monks and practitioners ought to learn and ought to understand the unconventional means of transmitting the Dharma, which is something that they will actually very likely encounter in their own path. They should not mistake the map for the territory. This is a very important point for advancing on the path and understanding the true nature of reality and enlightenment. Koans, for example, are a very unconventional means of communicating the teaching. Other practices that we've talked about, such as using the whacking stick whenever somebody is meditating, or throwing cold water on yourself, are very unconventional means for attaining some sort of fast and sudden realization of the teaching. Thus, this koan and what it refers to are very important for understanding the path and advancing on it, and also understanding the true nature of reality, and thus attaining enlightenment. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion and interpretation of Gutei's one finger. If you have a different interpretation, a question, or a different idea that you think is important in understanding this koan, I would love to hear it. Get in touch on social media and we'll discuss it together. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Wright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.